After the Napoleonic Wars, the major powers were focused on how to rebuild and maintain European order now that the fighting had ended. After all, since the mid-17th century, European nations had maintained balance through warfare. This back-and-forth conflict had lasted a century and a half. What they needed most was lasting peace. To achieve this, the powers sent representatives to convene in Vienna, Austria's capital, to discuss post-war European order. It was then that Metternich, Chancellor of the Habsburg Empire, stepped forward and proposed the third diplomatic principle we'll discuss today, the concert of nations. The concert of nations essentially sought to restore pre-French revolutionary conditions. Diplomatic matters would be handled through consultations among four legitimate monarchies: Austria, Russia, Britain, and Prussia, moving statecraft from battlefields to royal chambers. Nations wouldn't need actual military mobilization, just formal declarations of capabilities and claims. Territories would be allocated proportionally to prevent conflicts. This proved remarkably effective as institutional framework. European powers coordinated positions to suppress 1848 revolutions and managed major crises like the Crimean War between Britain, France, Turkey, and Russia through negotiated restraint. Even during such conflicts, nations maintained diplomatic engagement to prevent escalation. This system maintained relative European peace for nearly a century post-Napoleon. This balanced power framework became prototype for later League of Nations and UN. Now to our fourth principle, collective security. Europe's century-long peace shattered with World War starting 1914. Though Allies won 2-1, leaders faced familiar challenge, rebuilding war-torn continents, how to reconstruct global order and prevent future cataclysms. President Roosevelt's answer was collective security, rebuilding international order through shared peacekeeping responsibility. In Roosevelt's design, any breach of peace would be treated as collective challenge. All nations implement collective sanctions against aggressors to safeguard international peace and order. With 2-1-2 victory assured, President Roosevelt proposed the four policemen concept: US, Soviet, UK, and China as global enforcers. International disputes would be resolved through these four powers negotiations. Their combined military forces would enforce collective security through unified action. This vision materialized as the United Nations. France later joined to form the five-power coordination system. The UN Security Council became their decision-making body. Any Security Council veto from these five bloc's resolutions. This principle demonstrated wisdom. It balanced national interests through voting while recognizing power realities. Peace requires enforcement by major powers' combined strength. The 1990 Gulf War exemplified this collective security system. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait and overthrew its government. UN Resolution 660 demanded Iraqi withdrawal and peaceful resolution. After Iraqi defiance, US-led coalition launched 42-day military operation in January 1991. Iraq ultimately complied with UN demands. We've now covered all four diplomatic principles. These principles aim to constrain nations' interests, especially major powers, within frameworks. Balance of power, great power coordination, and collective security form escalating safeguards. These three principles create progressively stronger containment systems. These four principles encapsulate 4 centuries of diplomatic wisdom. Diplomatic history also contains painful lessons of failed negotiations. Because national interest supremacy remains the unshakable foundation of diplomacy, other principles inevitably face challenges from sovereign priorities. These challenges manifest in two primary forms. First, great power expansionism turns diplomacy into rivalry tools, ultimately making war the only diplomatic solution. Second, idealistic principles paralyze diplomacy when major powers hesitate to enforce rules through sanctions or force, rendering principles meaningless. W1-era diplomacy tragically exemplified both scenarios. Let's examine how imperial overreach equated diplomacy with warfare. In late 19th century, Bismarck unified Germany through blood and iron statecraft. As an emergent power, Germany could have destabilized Europe. But Bismarck combined political acumen with diplomatic mastery. He championed power equilibrium and great power coordination. Bismarck forged the League of Three Emperors, Germany, Russia, Austria, dominating continental politics. Britain maintained splendid isolation. France stood isolated. Through this alliance system, Bismarck created favorable balance, restraining potential adversaries. Germany's post-1871 restraint ensured British non-interference through calculated diplomacy. For decades after unification, Germany maintained restrained posture. Kaiser Wilhelm II's ascension changed everything. His imperial ambitions sought colonial expansion. Believing in German industrial military supremacy, he dismissed Bismarck and pursued aggressive Weltpolitik, challenging British naval dominance. Favoring Austria over Russia dissolved the Three Emperors League, abandoning diplomatic orthodoxy. These actions destroyed possibilities for great power coordination. Isolated Russia, allied with France, while Britain joined the Franco-Russian Entente against German expansion, polarizing Europe into Triple Alliance versus Triple Entente. Wilhelm II turned Bismarck's 3-1 advantage into 2-3 disadvantage through diplomatic blunders. This foreshadowed Germany's eventual WWI defeat. Pre-WI Germany's overconfidence in military power led to catastrophic miscalculations. Now let's examine how idealistic diplomacy caused tragedies. This brings us to WWI's aftermath. WWI shattered old empires and diplomatic frameworks. A lost generation, devastated continent, and revolutionary chaos made Europeans cry, "Never again war." The pressing question became how to achieve lasting peace. President Wilson offered his 14 points, advocating free trade, open diplomacy, self-determination. These ideals aim to rebuild collective security through moral principles. The League of Nations was established as enforcement mechanism, but Wilson overestimated moral persuasion while neglecting enforcement capabilities. Effective collective security required powerful enforcers, which the League lacked. The League relied on Beaujolais and Co. rather than concrete sanctions. When major powers acted aggressively, League resolutions proved toothless. This was evident in Japan's 1931 Manchuria invasion and Italy's 1935 Ethiopia campaign. The League only issued condemnations without meaningful action. Worse, League rules required unanimous consent, excluding involved parties, creating decision paralysis. This theoretically fair mechanism proved disastrous in practice. First, decision-making became sluggish and inefficient. With all nations responsible, no major power truly stepped up to lead. Second, the actual aggrieved nations' interests were drowned in collective deliberations, receiving inadequate consideration. Japan and Germany eventually recognized the League's weakness, defying international norms while claiming victimhood. They ultimately quit the League, rejecting Wilsonian principles entirely. The League could only watch as these nations trampled its authority. Were these claims of unfairness legitimate? While clearly pretexts for aggression, Wilson's inconsistent application of principles fueled grievances. The principle of self-determination birthed new states like Czechoslovakia and Poland from fallen empires. Yet German-speaking populations were denied this right. The Sudetenland's German majority was incorporated into Czechoslovakia against their will. Germany surrendered, believing in Wilson's ideals, only to face double standards. This perceived betrayal fueled German resentment. Germans sought vengeance through Hitler's rise, paving World War II's path. Thus, collective security's first attempt failed through idealistic constraints. With this, our diplomatic journey concludes. Kissinger's 4 principles emerge from centuries of statecraft: national interest supremacy, power equilibrium, great power coordination, collective security. History proves effective diplomacy balances might and morality. The 3 containment mechanisms: balance, coordination, security, form layered safeguards. For centuries, diplomatic wisdom crystallizes in these principles. The Allied Powers United Nations framework achieved this crucial balance after World War II. This effective peacekeeping system continues functioning as intended to this day. All right, folks, that concludes our exploration of diplomacy. Full notes are below. Catch you tomorrow.